All right, quick question before we start. You have a smartphone in your pocket. You use it to navigate, to calculate, to search, to communicate. The software running inside it depends on mathematical concepts so fundamental that most programmers don't even think about where they came from. Here is where they came from. A man sitting in Baghdad. In the year 820, working by candlelight. His name was Al-Khwarizmi. And without him, your phone doesn't exist. Your GPS doesn't exist. Modern banking doesn't exist. The entire digital world doesn't exist. You've never heard of him. Almost nobody has. And that is exactly the problem we're going to fix today. Because there was a moment in human history, roughly 750 to 1258 CE, when the most advanced civilization on Earth was not in Europe. It was not in China. It was in a city on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now Iraq. And what happened in that city during those 5 centuries changed everything about the world you live in. And then it was destroyed. And almost nobody talks about why. That's what we're doing today. Let's set the scene. The year is 750 CE. Europe is in what historians politely call the early medieval period. Less politely, it's sometimes called the Dark Ages. Most European cities have populations in the low thousands. Literacy is rare, mostly confined to monasteries. The infrastructure of the Roman Empire, the roads, the aqueducts, the legal systems, has been crumbling for 3 centuries. Life expectancy is short. Medicine is closer to superstition than science. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Mediterranean, something completely different is happening. The Abbasid Caliphate has just seized power in a revolution, moved its capital to a brand new city in Iraq, and begun one of the most deliberate state-sponsored explosions of human knowledge in history. The city is Baghdad, and within 50 years, it will be the largest city on Earth. At its center is an institution called the House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah in Arabic. And this place is unlike anything that has existed before. It is not a library, although it has the largest collection of manuscripts in the world. It is not a university, although scholars from every corner of the known world come to study and teach there. It is something new. A state-funded research institution with a single mission: gather all the knowledge in the world, translate it, study it, and then go beyond it. The Caliph al-Ma'mun sends agents to Byzantium, to India, to Persia, with instructions to bring back manuscripts. Greek texts that Europe has forgotten exist are carried to Baghdad and translated into Arabic. Euclid, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Galen, Pythagoras, the entire inheritance of ancient Greek thought, preserved and transmitted at a moment when European monasteries were struggling to keep basic literacy alive. But here is the crucial thing, and I need you to hear this clearly. They didn't just preserve it, they argued with it. They found the mistakes. They went further. Al-Khwarizmi took Greek and Indian mathematics and built something entirely new on top of it. His book Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala gave us algebra. The word al-Jabr is literally where the word algebra comes from. His own name, transliterated into Latin, gave us the word algorithm. Every time your phone's navigation app recalculates your route, it is running a descendant of methods developed by a man who died in Baghdad in 850 CE. That is not metaphor. That is direct, traceable, intellectual inheritance. Ibn al-Haytham, working in the 10th and 11th centuries, wrote the Book of Optics. He described how light travels, how the eye works, how lenses bend light. He developed a method of forming hypotheses, testing them against careful observation, and revising based on results. The scientific method, 600 years before Francis Bacon in England got the credit for inventing it. 600 years! Avicenna Ibn Sina wrote the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century, a systematic encyclopedia of everything medicine knew about the human body, disease, treatment, pharmacology. It was the standard medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. Not the 11th century, the 17th century. 600 years of European doctors trained on a book written in Arabic by a Persian scholar. Al-Biruni calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 1% accuracy. In the 11th century, using a method he devised himself, Al-Zahrawi Abulcasis in Latin, wrote a 30-volume medical encyclopedia that included the first systematic description of hundreds of surgical procedures. He invented surgical instruments that were still being used in modified form in the 20th century. He described hemophilia. He described the use of catgut for internal stitches. He performed the first known thyroid surgery. Al-Idrisi created the most accurate map of the world that existed in the 12th century. So accurate that it remained a reference for navigators for 3 centuries after his death. The list goes on, and on, and on. And all of it, every single one of these achievements, happened in a civilization that almost nobody in the Western world learns about in school. You learn about ancient Greece. You learn about Rome. You learn about the Renaissance. And somehow, between Rome and the Renaissance, there is a gap in the story, as if human beings just stopped thinking for 800 years and then suddenly started again in Florence. They didn't stop thinking, they were thinking in Arabic. And then Europe translated their work, removed the attribution, and called it the foundation of Western civilization. Which it is, just not in the way the story is usually told. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because this civilization, this extraordinary world-leading civilization, collapsed. And understanding why it collapsed is the whole point of this story. Because the reasons are not ancient history. The reasons are a checklist that looks uncomfortably familiar. The collapse came in layers, no single cause, no single moment. A slow erosion of the specific conditions that had made the Golden Age possible. Layer 1, political fragmentation. The early Abbasid caliphs were strong central rulers who personally championed intellectual inquiry. Al-Ma'mun didn't just fund the House of Wisdom, he participated in its debates. He cared about ideas. But by the 9th century, the caliphs had made a decision that would slowly hollow out their own power. They imported Turkish slave soldiers, Mamluks, as their personal military force because they didn't trust their own armies. The Mamluks were extraordinarily effective fighters. They were also extraordinarily quick to realize that whoever controls the army controls everything. Within decades, caliphs were being blinded, imprisoned, and assassinated by their own bodyguards. The caliph became a ceremonial figurehead, a face on the coins. Real power shifted to military commanders who had no particular interest in funding scholarship. When the center stopped investing in knowledge, the ecosystem started to starve. Layer 2, the intellectual shift. In the early 11th century, a scholar named Al-Ghazali wrote a book called The Incoherence of the Philosophers. Al-Ghazali was not a fool. He was arguably one of the most brilliant minds of the medieval world. His argument was sophisticated Greek philosophical methods, when applied to Islamic theology, led to conclusions that contradicted core Islamic beliefs. The philosophers were claiming the universe was eternal, not created. They were questioning divine providence. Al-Ghazali said this was heresy dressed up as reason. He was enormously influential. His arguments spread through the great madrasas, the Islamic educational institutions, and gradually shifted the intellectual prestige of the civilization away from rational philosophy and toward religious law and theology. Science continued. Mathematics continued. Medicine continued. But they were increasingly seen as tools, practical necessities, rather than ends in themselves. The deep conviction that understanding the world was a sacred duty, that God's creation deserved to be studied for its own sake, began to fade from the institutions. And when an idea loses its institutional home, it becomes fragile. Layer 3, the Mongols. In 1258, Hulagu Khan's army surrounded Baghdad. The caliph refused to surrender. He seems to have believed God would protect the city. The city fell in days. What followed was one of the worst single events of destruction in human history. The killing lasted for weeks. The libraries were burned. Manuscripts that existed in no other copies anywhere in the world were thrown into the Tigris River. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, irreplaceable, unique records of human thought were gone in days. Contemporary sources wrote that the river ran black with ink. Think about that. The river ran black with ink. And the agricultural infrastructure, the ancient irrigation systems that had made Mesopotamia fertile for thousands of years, was shattered. The farms that fed the scholars, that generated the surplus, that funded the libraries, went to ruin. The physical foundation of the civilization was broken. You cannot rebuild an intellectual culture without food. You cannot fund a research institution when the fields are rubble. The Islamic world recovered, eventually. Cairo became a new center of learning. The Ottomans rose to extraordinary heights. Individual scholars continued producing brilliant work for centuries. But the specific chain, that particular unbroken thread of inquiry that ran from the 8th century House of Wisdom through 500 years of continuous innovation, that thread was cut, and it was never fully reconnected. Meanwhile, Europe was translating everything. In Toledo, Spain, as Christian forces gradually reconquered Islamic territory, European scholars found themselves in possession of libraries unlike anything they had ever seen, and they began translating. Euclid came back to Europe through Arabic. Aristotle came back through Arabic. The medicine of Avicenna and Al-Razi became the curriculum of European universities. Al-Khwarizmi's algebra became the foundation of European mathematics. The European Renaissance was not a straight line from ancient Greece. It was ancient Greece, filtered through 500 years of Islamic scholarship, transmitted back to Europe by translators who often removed the Arabic names from the source material. When Copernicus published his heliocentric theory of the solar system in 1543, he was building on astronomical tables that had been calculated in observatories in Baghdad and Samarkand. The very stars he was naming had Arabic names: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, Rigel, Deneb, names given by Islamic astronomers that we still use today because they were the ones who charted them. The European Renaissance did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from a foundation laid in Baghdad. And almost nobody says so. So here is what I want you to take from this. The Islamic Golden Age is not a story about Muslims. Or not only that, it is a story about what happens when you create the right conditions for human intelligence to operate. Unified networks that let ideas travel. Active investment by institutions that believe knowledge is worth funding. Openness to learning from outside your own tradition. A material base of prosperity that can support people who are thinking about things that don't have an immediate practical use. When those conditions exist, human beings do extraordinary things. They always have. They always will. And when those conditions are eroded, by political fragmentation, by intellectual closure, by military catastrophe, by the destruction of the material foundation, the extraordinary things stop. Not immediately, not all at once, but steadily, irreversibly, until one day someone looks around and realizes that the river of knowledge has run dry. The people of Baghdad in 850 CE were not thinking about collapse. They were living in the most advanced city in the world, surrounded by the most brilliant minds of their era, reading books that contained everything humanity had figured out up to that point, and building new knowledge on top of it every single day. They did not see it coming. That is the lesson. Not that Islamic civilization failed, but that no civilization is permanent. The conditions that make greatness possible are always fragile. They always have to be maintained. And they are always, somewhere, being quietly eroded by forces that each look manageable on their own. Al-Khwarizmi is dead. The House of Wisdom is rubble. The river no longer runs black with ink. But every time you open an app, run a calculation, navigate a route, search for an answer, you are using tools built on a foundation he helped lay. He deserves to have his name remembered. That is the story of the Islamic Golden Age.